Patricia, and thank you all for taking the time out of your day to learn more about this important topic. As many of you know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. If you didn't know, it's on the slide right there. And stalking and sexual assault intersect, overlap, and co-occur really in a variety of ways. And in fact, you'll see as we go through the presentation that stalking is really about fear. That fear element is really essential to the definition of stalking. And fear of sexual assault is certainly entwined with stalking's very definition. In fact, sexual assault is explicitly mentioned in multiple stalking statutes. And while these crimes are clearly related, and you might see that from your work in the field, we certainly see that here at Spark, we find that stalking is often left out of the conversation on sexual assault and sexual violence more broadly. So this webinar is really here to provide an overview of some of those connections, and I really appreciate you taking the time to consider a stalking perspective for the essential sexual assault work that you're doing. So before we get too much into content here, I want to acknowledge that we are supported by the Office of Violence Against Women. Spark is the national technical assistance and training provider for OVW on stalking. So if you're looking for webinars like you're seeing right now, in-person training, online resources, individual organizational assistance, so if you're working on a stalking case or a sexual assault case, you think stalking might be involved and you're saying, huh, I wonder what technology might be being used here or something like that, you can always reach out to us. We're happy to talk you through that. Policy and protocol development and consultation. So if you realize, hey, which victims of stalking do we serve? Do we serve them all? How do we decide? We can definitely help you out with that. And National Stalking Awareness Month materials. National Stalking Awareness Month is in January. Not quite as well known as April for Sexual Assault Awareness Month yet, but we are in charge of all the resources for that. So we have plenty of activities, curricula, social media platforms, etc., and you can access those on our website year-round. Speaking of our website, it is stalkingawareness.org. I've linked it here in the web links as well under Spark website. We have training modules, victim resources, practitioner guides. We have especially resources for law enforcement, victim advocates, and some for victims themselves. And this webinar is being recorded and will be housed on there for you to listen again and again when you're like, wow, what a great webinar. I wish all my colleagues could listen. You're in luck because it will be housed right there. You can find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our handle is Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor here at Spark, and if not, it'll be a long hour for you. So really your call. Either way, I can't hear you, so I'll just keep on talking. But that is where we tend to share a lot of resources. We've been sharing social media posts and relevant articles about sexual assault and stalking all month, so definitely suggest that you follow us there for the latest and greatest stalking resources. So before we go too much further, I'd love to get a sense of who is able to join us today. If you could just let me know which discipline you most closely identify with. And of course, it takes us all, it's a multidisciplinary approach to help victims and to hold offenders accountable. So I appreciate all that you do in whatever role that you may have. I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. It looks like a good mix of folks. If you're in the other, I would love to, if you don't mind, in the chat box indicating what your role is, just so we can get a better sense of who's able to join us. But it looks like got about a lot of DV and SA program staff, about 1 in 5 are victim advocates. Got some law enforcement, prosecutors, mental health professionals on the call. Okay, we have a paralegal, great. Prevention education specialist, that's well, you're all my favorite, but my background's doing awareness education, and we're working on some awareness education resources on stalking right now, so definitely feel free to reach out to me. Okay, great, thanks so much. And thanks for all that you do. And I'm just curious, have you had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking before? So it might have been mentioned in some other training you've done, but have you been to a stalking training before? Let's see. I'll give you just a few seconds, and there's no shame in that. We find that I do these presentations across the country, and we typically ask the room, and often about a third to the whole room say this is the first time they've had the opportunity to attend training on stalking. So looks like that's true. Some of you have been here a few times, and feel free, please add your insights throughout in that chat box because we all learn from each other and you're already doing essential work on stalking. But it looks like for about 1 in 3 of you, this is the first time you've been able to attend a training specifically on stalking. And it just kind of shows how a little bit behind we are in talking about stalking in our field. And I'm sure you've all seen the Power and Control Wheel plenty of times. We all knew it was Stalking Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and all that's great. I'm not knocking that in any way. But we're a little bit behind on stalking. We don't always get that specialized training. So it makes me extra appreciative that you took the time to share this today, to share this time with me today. So today we'll be talking about first understanding stalking and just spending a little time on that foundational piece of, what is stalking. And this webinar will provide an overview of just some of the connections between stalking and sexual assault. So first we'll talk about what do stalking and sexual assault have in common, different ways that stalkers might use sexual assault or sexual violence, whether the threat or the actual realization of that sexual violence to scare their victims, focus a little bit on intimate partner stalkers, kind of intersecting with domestic violence, talk briefly about other forms of sexual violence, and then leave you with some response suggestions and some resources for further learning. So I really hope that today, we have an hour. It'll feel short to me. It might feel long to you, hopefully not. But I really hope that today's a starting point for your exploration of stalking and sexual assault and your integration of a stalking response into your sexual assault response, either building on what you're already doing or getting you to think a little bit differently about integrating stalking, and that this is just step one, and we'll be talking more and hearing more about sexual assault and stalking all year round. So without further ado, understanding stalking. And again, I just won't spend a ton of time, but I want to make sure we're all coming from a common understanding of what stalking is and isn't. So as you can imagine, in our field, of course, there's no consensus about what the definition of really anything is. So there's the legal definitions that vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and there's behavioral definition. We'll focus more on the behavioral definition because that just gives us a better sense of what stalkers really do and what stalking really looks like. But I do want to point out that while state statutes vary, one thing that is agreed on across the country is that stalking is a crime. It is a crime at the federal level, in all 50 states, in the District of Columbia and U.S. territories, in tribal codes, and in the military justice system. So it is a criminal act. It can be a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the jurisdiction and the specifics of the case. But a lot of times victims don't realize what's happening is actually criminal, and it's essential to realize that. So behaviorally, we define stalking as a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So I know that doesn't quite roll off the tongue. I'm going to break that down, some of the big concepts here. So stalking is a pattern of behavior. Similar to domestic violence, it's not a single incident or a one-off event. And it's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me say pattern of behavior, course of conduct, and use those interchangeably. I'm really talking about the same thing. Most statutes say 2 or more behaviors constitute a course of conduct or a pattern of behavior. And those behaviors can be quite diverse. And some of those behaviors are crimes on their own, and some are actually legal outside the context of a stalking crime. So for example, if I was stalking Patricia, our host, because I'm a terrible presenter, right? Maybe on Monday, I'm texting her all day. Tuesday, I get mad she hasn't responded. I smash her windows. Wednesday, I feel bad. I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors that could be part of a stalking course of conduct, even though some would be legal outside that context. Like it's not illegal to send someone a gift or to text them until you put this together as a pattern of behavior. At the same time, other behaviors are illegal on their own, like vandalism, property damage, sexual assault, other crimes that exist. And in our field, we tend to be, whether we're law enforcement or sometimes victim advocates as well, we can be quite incident-based and reactive. So what you'll hear me say over and over again is with the stalking case, we want to kind of take a step back and take a broader view and have that stalking lens on and say, okay, I see this vandalism or I see this sexual assault. Could this also be stalking? Could we safety plan around stalking, get another charge on stalking, prosecute stalking, name stalking for a variety of reasons around this? And the answer is not always yes, but sometimes it is. So hoping to get you to think about that a little bit today. So it is a pattern of behavior. It is directed at a specific individual. Now, that being said, we do sometimes see what we call target dispersion, which is perhaps a stalker is stalking like an ex-partner. That ex-partner starts seeing someone new. So now the stalker is fixated on the new person and their ex-partner. And the stalker may also contact the victim's friends or family or colleagues. So certainly a lot of people can be impacted by a stalking case, but it's still in the purpose and for the goal of reaching that one single individual. So that's what stalking is directed at, that specific person, that one victim. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really essential to the definition of stalking. Fear is really what separates stalking from a crime it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically repeated behavior that would make someone feel annoyed or angry. And harassment can be quite serious, so I'm not trying to minimize it in any way. But with stalking, that fear component is really, really essential, and some statutes add fear or emotional distress. But when we talk about fear, that's tough, right? Because fear is subjective. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch, this is literally a 5-second video, and I want you to think about which person here you identify with more. So Patricia, if you could pull that up real quick. Okay, so I know on mine it's stalled a little bit. I'm sorry if it's that for you as well. But for those who couldn't see, basically there's this, man and woman hanging out. The spider approaches and the woman absolutely panics. And the man is looking at her like, can you please get it together? So for some of you, you might be identifying closely with the woman here, like that's terrifying, we're moving, burn the house down. Some of you might be sympathizing with the man here who's kind of rolling his eyes at her. You can kind of understand where this guy's coming from. It's just this little spider, like why does she have to freak out so much, right? But what if I told you that the same woman had been bitten by a spider a year prior and had a terrible allergic reaction and almost died? Sorry, didn't mean to click around there. And almost died and had to go to the hospital. Would that change your perception of her reaction? And I would hope that it would, because what I gave you there was context, right? Without that context, it's really hard to understand why this person is freaking out, why they're scared, why they're experiencing fear. So we need to ask the right questions to get at that context, because victims know something that we don't about their situation. So for instance, this was a stalking case in which this woman called the police. She was hysterical, and all she would say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. And so the police, understandably, are not exactly sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, do you prefer tea? What's the big deal? And eventually she calmed down enough and said, he's here. Now it turned out this was a stalking victim who had relocated. She was being stalked by an abusive ex-boyfriend, address confidentiality, everything, had really felt that she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning, gets in her car, and there's a cup of coffee with this old nickname for her on it. So I know I can't hear you, unfortunately, but usually in a presentation, people kind of make a sort of noise there. And that's a reasonable person would feel fear, right? But we need to ask those questions or else we don't understand why a cup of coffee is scary. But even these items that seem innocuous, innocent, or even nice can be scary in the context of a stalking case. So something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you. So we want to ask them, what message did that send? Why was that scary to you? And stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. So the classic example is a offender saying, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? And this woman receives roses, she panics, and her coworkers are, oh, that's so sweet, he wants you back, right? So that's specific meaning. And again, it's quite confusing because it criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. So a lot of times stalking victims are thinking, what am I supposed to do, call the police because someone sent me flowers or rang my doorbell? And the answer is, yes, those are criminal activities actually in the context of a stalking case. So we want to understand that as service providers, and we want victims to understand that as well, so that they recognize that all the behaviors they're experiencing, even ones that aren't crimes on their own, if they are causing fear and would cause a reasonable person to feel fear, that's part of that stalking course of conduct, and it's relevant and important. Now, it can also be hard to know if a victim's experiencing fear because, as those of you know out there know with the work that you do, victims are unlikely to come and say, they're not going to call you and say, excuse me, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear, right? They're not going to say that. They're going to say something more along the lines of, my ex has gotten creepy, my neighbor's being weird, my boss is harassing me, and they may not want to say, I am afraid. They might say, I'm angry, I'm annoyed, I'm freaked out, I don't like what's going on, right? So we need to ask the right questions to get at that sense of fear. And victims might also minimize the experience because of the trauma that they're going through. So there's a case my colleague Jen Landheis worked where a victim did not tell the police that she said, oh, he threatened to kill me and I came to the police station, then later said, are they going to take his gun away? And she's like, what gun? Made sure the responding officers knew and said, I'm curious why you didn't mention there was a gun. He said, oh, and she said, oh, he puts a gun in my face all the time. He never actually hurt me, right? So that's an extreme example, but it's that minimization. And it's not that victims are unreasonable, but that's where that reasonable person standard is actually really helpful, because if most people would say, oh, that's scary, right? Even if the victim's not using that language exactly, or their perception of things has been altered because of the abuse they've experienced, that can still be fear and that can still be stalking. So stalking is extremely prevalent. About 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men will experience stalking in the United States in their lifetime. And if you look at these statistics, if we're talking about sexual violence, that's around 1 in 5 women, depending what statistic you're reading, right? 1 in 4, 1 in 5. So stalking's not far behind. And this definition actually used a really strong definition of stalking. It said that respondents had to say they felt very fearful. And when they piloted this and took out that very, it's actually more like 1 in 4 women. So I think we're going to see the rates go up, not as a result of necessarily more stalking, but because more of the stalking already going on might be captured by further research. So again, I want to bring you back when I asked, for whom is this your first stalking training? And about 1 in 3 of you, this is the first time you've been able to attend a training on stalking. And it really just shows, and again, it's not reflective of you or your work or anything like that. It's just that it's so common that we don't talk about stalking all that much, even though the rates here are quite comparable to domestic and sexual violence. And the truth is, with the work that you're already doing for victims and to hold offenders accountable, I guarantee you're already working on stalking cases. You may just not be labeling it as stalking or following up on it as stalking. So people of all ages can experience stalking, all the way from children up to older adults. We actually have a webinar on our website that we did with NCALL about stalking of older adults. The 18 to 24-year-olds tend to experience the highest rates among adults, similar to the sexual assault perpetration and experience. So when I Google stalking images, because, I'm fun at parties and stuff, these are the kind of things that come up. And as you can see, there's a lot of sort of shadowy figures, background. My favorite's this guy in a mask and a hoodie and behind a laptop. So there's a lot of this sort of shadowy hoodie figure. But it probably won't surprise you all in the field to know that the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the perpetrator. So I don't expect that to surprise you, but when I'm talking to folks outside the field about stalking, their mind goes right to celebrity stalking. That's usually what people think about. So similar to sexual assault, where people will say, it can't be sexual assault because I knew the person, people might say that about stalking as well. But the majority of stalking cases, victims do know their perpetrators. About half the time, it's a current or former intimate partner. So that's domestic violence related, about an extension of power and control. But the point I want to make strongly is if about half the time it's an intimate partner, that means about half the time it is not an intimate partner, right? So often our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence response. And that's not wrong, but it's also incomplete because about half the time stalking victims are not, it's not related to domestic violence. So I encourage you all to think about your programming and do you serve victims of stalking? Do you serve all victims of stalking, even if there's no domestic violence or sexual violence involved, if you're a rape crisis center, for example? If not, do you know where to refer those folks? And also, would they necessarily come to you? Because if someone experiences stalking from, let's say, a coworker, it may not be intuitive to them to go to something like the Family Violence Center, for example, right? So just something to think about. And actually, one of the links here I have this SADD org checklist on stalking, and that's just a checklist that can help you and your organization think about, is the word stalking on our website? Which victims of stalking do we serve or not serve? That kind of thing. So I encourage you to download that and talk about that with your staff. There's so many different stalking behaviors. Here are some of the most common ones. Most stalkers use multiple behaviors, including unwanted phone calls and messages, spreading rumors, following or spying, etc. And most are using multiple strategies at once. And that all being said, I want to move on to our main topic of the day, which is about stalking and sexual assault specifically. So as I've already alluded to, stalking and sexual assault actually have quite a bit in common in terms of those crimes and some of the issues that victims face. They're both extremely prevalent. 1 in 6 women experience stalking, and about 1 in 5 women experience completed or attempted rape in their lifetime. So the prevalence rates are quite high. They're frequently misunderstood crimes that can be hard for victims to identify. And a lot of the reasons for that are quite similar. When it's somebody that the victim knows, they might say, well, it couldn't be stalking or it couldn't be sexual assault because I know the person. Victims are likely to blame themselves or to minimize their experiences and say, oh, it wasn't so bad, or maybe I sent a mixed message, or maybe I in some way invited that behavior. And they're also likely to be blamed by outsiders for that behavior, right? Well, did you really tell him no? Did you really tell him to stop contacting you? That kind of victim blaming is really common with both crimes. It can be deeply traumatic with serious and lifelong mental health impacts on victims and survivors. And of course, the trauma of that always looking over your shoulder, thinking back to the experience, not feeling safe, not feeling able to trust others can happen with both crimes. Like I said before, most often perpetrated by someone the victim knows, and probably unsurprisingly to you as well, often underreported to law enforcement, and for many of the same reasons. Minimization of the crime, not identifying what happened as a crime because it doesn't fit with the myths that exist around that crime. So that it's not a shadowy stranger, that it's someone I knew, that it was complicated, there were multiple incidents, all of that kind of stuff. That confusion can lead to underreporting, as well as a distrust of law enforcement and a belief that it won't be followed up with. So there's also a co-occurrence of sexual assault and stalking. So this is a survey of young people ages 18 to 24, and it simply asks them, if they'd experienced sexual assault and stalking. It didn't have to be by the same perpetrator. So overall, about half of respondents who experienced some form of sexual assault, so that could be attempted, completed, drug-facilitated penetration, and or oral sex, since the August of the year they graduated high school, these were college students, had also experienced stalking behaviors that invoked fear. So a lot of people are experiencing both of those things. When we talk about fear, you might be thinking, well, fear of what? And some statutes are quite specific about what a victim can feel fear about. And the ones that do specify often say physical harm or physical violence, and actually 8 state statutes spell out sexual assault as something that a victim might fear in a stalking case. So again, the crimes are so highly related, but not always talked about together. There's multiple ways that a stalker might use sexual violence, again, because stalking is about fear. You can understand that there's multiple ways that threatened or actual sexual violence can be used to scare victims. So a stalker might threaten or plan to sexually assault the victim. So that threat of sexual violence can be quite scary. They can get someone else to sexually assault the victim or try to do so, a third party, and I'll give you some examples of that in a second. They might actually sexually assault the victim as part of their course of conduct, like I said, that co-occurring crime, right? That's part of that pattern of behavior. Or they might contact the victim after sexual assault. And of course, a stalker might do all of these things, right? They're not necessarily only doing one or the other, but here's just some common ways that it can intersect. So let's talk about stalking to commit sexual assault. We're going to watch just a short video, hopefully it'll play okay, that just kind of clearly shows how stalking can be used to plan to commit a crime. Now there's so many crimes that stalking co-occurs with, but this one happens to be a crime of a sexual nature that I think kind of illustrates how that can go together. So Patricia, if you could play that. Thanks.
A 72-year-old man cuffed and jailed for allegedly stalking a 12-year-old girl at her bus stop in Pinellas County. Arrest records say Abdullah Drajoni followed the girl from her Largo bus stop for over a month, then touched her inappropriately. The next day, police had a lookout while the child got off her bus, and when Drajoni followed her again, they arrested him. He now faces molestation and aggravated stalking charges.
A month, and her route. Oh, it looks like I was muted there for a second, so let me just start that again. Sorry. So for those who couldn't see, he essentially was watching this young girl, for about a month on her route home, and then, you know, because he knew exactly where she'd be, what time she'd be there, actually approached her and molested her. So a very straightforward example of stalking with the intent to commit a sexual crime. And this is just one of many examples of that. There's just a case that came out last week about a man he's a copy machine repairman, and he went into several office buildings. This was out of the Bay Area in California, found women there, and then stalked them to find out where they lived, and then showed up at their homes with the intent to commit sexual assault. So that information gathering and contact and watching and surveillance, some stalkers are doing that because they're planning to commit a sexual crime. So it's a crime in its own right, and it can co-occur with another crime like molestation or sexual assault. Also want you to think about grooming for sexual assault as stalking. So for the university folks who are joining us, and probably others as well, you might be really familiar with the David Lesick research, and I won't go over it in tons of detail, but essentially this was research about repeat rape perpetrators on college campuses, and it doesn't capture all kinds of sexual assault on campus. So it was talking about a specific kind of perpetrator. And in this survey, about 6% of the men surveyed met the criteria for attempted or completed rape, and these are repeat perpetrators who averaged about 6 rapes per person, and they had a very specific MO, okay, a certain pattern that they would engage in to find, groom, and these victims and commit the assault. And so they often chose targets intentionally. They identified vulnerable young women, often focusing on freshmen, so young women who may not have experience with drinking or with partying. They engage in contact with them multiple times. They might invite them to a party. So that could be through social media, in person, texting, call, variety of contacts to flatter these young women and invite them to an event. Once the women arrive at the event, the rapist would ply that young woman with alcohol, and they would control the alcohol, isolate the victim, often to a room they set up specifically to commit that assault, commit the sexual assault, and then often contact them after to say anything from, you know, thanks for a great time, to you better not say anything, to some conflation or back and forth between the two. Some also had third parties, like, for example, a fraternity brother threaten the victim after. So if you think about that and think back to the definition of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Well, yes, they're engaging in a very specific pattern of behavior. Is it directed at a specific person? Yes, it is. They're targeting specific women. It's not just whoever happens to be walking by. Would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Yes. And you might be thinking, well, hold on. She may have not been afraid that whole time, right? Like if you asked a college freshman woman who'd experienced sexual assault in this way, she might say, well, at first I wasn't afraid when an attractive upperclassman approached me. I was flattered, right? But now that I look back on this entire pattern of behavior and realize the entire thing was a setup for my sexual assault, that is terrifying. So there's no stalking statute that says when fear has to attach. Fear can attach at any time. So if a reasonable person would feel fear, which certainly a young woman in this position most likely would, that can still be a stalking case. And to go back to this for a second, you might be thinking, well, like, why? Who cares? You know, do I have to? And not all sexual assault grooming is stalking. So I'm not saying this is always the case, but it's an important lens to have on for a few reasons. One is that especially when prosecuting or adjudicating through the campus system, like a campus-based sexual assault, it can come down to this one moment of consent, right? And a perpetrator might be very likely to tell you and open to telling you, no, I really liked this person. So here's all the times I contacted and texted them and showed up, and here's all the contact we had. And then maybe you're going for actually a stalking charge. So they might love to talk to you and not realize you're coming in with another angle, not in place of the sexual assault charge, but it's always nice to have a menu of options for prosecutors or adjudicators or whoever you might be working with. So that can be really helpful. Here's another example, really combining a lot of different sexually abusive behaviors that kind of illustrates how this can also go together. So in this one, this man used the persona of a minor league baseball player, so there's some impersonation, to lure teenage girls and young women into giving him their phone number. So he goes online through dating websites and social media websites, gets their phone numbers, and then begins threatening them with violence if they don't send him sexually degrading selfies. And then after they do that, he threatens to publicly humiliate them by posting the photographs if the victims do not meet him in person for sex. So that's that, even though they call him a cyber rapist here, which is interesting, he's not committing physical sexual assault, but it is still a sexually violent crime. And it's also stalking, right? It's a pattern of behavior. He's targeting specific people that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Some stalkers also solicit a third party to commit or to attempt to get a third party to commit sexual violence. So this is a pretty famous case with this former Marine, Jebediah Stipe, and what he did was he went on Craigslist and impersonated his ex-girlfriend and wrote, I'm looking for a, quote, real aggressive man. I have a rape fantasy and I want him to come rape me, okay? And so because our world's a terrible place, someone, of course, saw this on Craigslist and actually went to her home and committed that sexual assault. She was violently raped. And the only good news in this case is that not only was the actual physical rapist held accountable, but so was the ex who had facilitated the sexual assault. So that's another example of stalking through this sort of third party, trying to get someone else to commit that. And again, you may be thinking, well, how could they experience fear if she may or may not even know that ad was up? But if a reasonable person would feel fear, fear can attach at any time once again, so she could experience that later. This is a similar case, really interesting one, in which a man's ex-boyfriend created a Grindr account impersonating him. So Grindr is a gay dating website. So he just took pictures of his ex, said, this is me, this is where I live, this is what I'm into, and would message with these men. And so over years, hundreds of men have approached Erik for sex, and Erik is saying, I'm not even on Grindr. What is this? And so Erik says, I love this quote, the person controlling the fake profiles will often tell the visitors Erik will say no when he means yes, or that he'd send them away only to hide them from his jealous roommate and that they should return. So you could see where this could clearly end in certainly the threat of, if not actual sexual violence for this man, and that this is just another way that stalkers can be using technology, in this case, to get someone else to commit sexual assault. So a stalker may also stalk after a sexual assault. So they've committed the assault and then they begin to stalk. They might have been stalking before as well to commit it with that plan to commit a crime that we talked about earlier. They might also begin stalking after they commit the assault. So when we think about contact after, I encourage you to think really broadly about contact, because contact can be that in-person, showing up, talking to. It could be third person, like talking to a mutual friend and saying, hey, you better keep your mouth shut, or why don't you hang around with us anymore, or here's a rumor I heard about you. Like I said earlier, spreading rumors is a really common tactic that stalkers utilize. It could also be through social networking sites where someone posts on their own page, right? So like I'm still a Facebook user because I'm old, so I will post on, so if I posted something on my Facebook, again, about my hypothetical stalking of Patricia, sorry Patricia, and I said, oh, I heard this about Patricia, or Patricia better be quiet if she knows what's good for her, or something like that. Even though that wasn't to Patricia, it still can be contact directed at her that would cause her to feel fear, right? So I really encourage you to think broadly about that and all the different ways, especially now through the use of technology, that contact might work. This is a case I thought was an interesting example where a woman actually sexually assaulted her friend and then created a fake Facebook account and contacted that sexual assault victim through it and kept talking to her. So the friend didn't realize she was talking to the perpetrator. And she said, you know, at the trial, finding out the person who sexually assaulted me was the one receiving my text made my road to recovery even longer. So that's stalking after a sexual assault to kind of convince the victim that what happened was not, in fact, rape or sexual violence. So there's all these different ways that it can connect. And probably more too. So I want to focus really quickly specifically on intimate partner stalkers. Now, like I said before, in all the stalking cases, about half the time it's intimate partners, which again means about half the time it's not intimate partners. So I really don't want to overemphasize intimate partner stalkers or have us forget even for a moment that a lot of stalking cases are not actually related to domestic violence. But to focus on intimate partner stalkers is also important because it's a big piece of it. That's in so much of the work that you do. And also because intimate partner stalkers tend to be the most dangerous. They pose the greatest threats to their victims. Now, often when I hear in the field about stalking, people seem to think it only happens after a relationship ends. So you might hear someone saying, oh, the relationship was abusive, and then because it's often a she, left, and then he began to stalk her. But let's look back at what was going on during that relationship. If he was texting her constantly, asking friends and family where she was, monitoring her, tracking her, that's stalking, right? And that can be happening before a relationship, during a relationship, and or after a relationship. As this chart shows, about half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well. So we want to name it that. It's not just stalking after. Many of you probably know that statistic that about, it takes an average of 7 times for a domestic violence victim to leave their abuser. What's that really about? More often than not, that's about stalking, right? It's about that continued contact and that extension of power and control. So stalking is a huge part of many abusive relationships before, during, and after the relationship. Like I said, intimate partner stalkers, they pose the greatest threats to their victims. So they're more likely to physically approach the victim. They tend to be more insulting, interfering, and threatening. They're more likely to use weapons. Their behaviors are most likely to escalate quickly over non-intimate partner stalkers. And the reoffender rate's very high for stalking in general, and those intimate partner stalkers are even more likely to reoffend. That all being said, all stalkers can be dangerous. So I don't mean to suggest that just because someone's not an intimate partner stalker, they're not dangerous. All stalkers can be dangerous. All of them can escalate their behaviors. But those intimate partner stalkers tend to pose the greatest threats to their victims in this and more ways. And women who are stalked by partners experience psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and injury at significantly higher rates compared with women who were not stalked by their partners. So there is a relationship, there is that co-victimization between stalking and other types of abuse that makes them more likely to experience a variety of things, including our topic focus today, which is sexual abuse, sexual assault, and other forms of sexual violence. So speaking of intimate partners and other forms of sexual violence, and I have a few charts here, so stick with me. I promise, like, you're not a chart person. Don't panic. I'll give you the big picture. So this is a study of women with protection orders against an abusive partner. So all of these women in the study had been abused. But this asked them, okay, if you've been abused, how many of these other sexually abusive behaviors are you experiencing? And so as you see, the rates are quite high. About half are experiencing sexual degradation, sexual coercion, for example. Okay, so then the survey said, all right, so if you've been abused and stalked, how likely are you to experience these behaviors? And wow, look how high that goes up from about a little under half of sexual degradation to now nearly 2/3 are experiencing sexual degradation. That implicit threats and force goes from about 1 in 5 to nearly half. So that stalking component is really adding to the likelihood that they'll experience these sexually abusive behaviors. Then the survey went one further and said, okay, what if you experience abuse, stalking, and rape? And here, wow, the rates are incredibly high. And I think that first one's actually a really good kind of benchmark indicator where, of course, the rates are high for abuse only. And of course, when I say only, I don't mean that to minimize how terrible abuse is. But for people who are experiencing just abuse, sexual degradation, 45%. You add stalking, 61%. Stalking and rape, 100%. And so this co-victimization is really, really essential to ask about. And yet, I often hear stalking, I hear people talk about co-victimization and trauma, but sometimes stalking doesn't come into that conversation. And It really should, because not only is stalking a serious and dangerous crime in its own right, but it's also a predictor and an indicator that there could be other kinds of risk and other kinds of violence, including sexual violence, going on. So you want to think about the sexual assault victims you're working with and ask, do you ask them if they've experienced stalking? Because sometimes we ask stalking victims if they've experienced sexual assault, but it's less often we ask sexual assault victims if they've experienced stalking. And the more research we can have to really illustrate the co-occurrence of these crimes, the better. So we're talking about other forms of sexual violence here in addition to rape, and I wanted to highlight just a couple of them. One is sexual harassment. So, like I said earlier, the difference between harassment and stalking is really about that fear element. So harassment is about creating a hostile or offensive environment and includes behaviors such as making sexual comments, jokes, or advances. So harassment tends to be annoying, would make someone angry, would make someone offended or uncomfortable. But the word harassment is often used to describe things that are actually stalking. Like all the time I see articles that talk about, someone received 100 death threats, they were being harassed. Well, no, that's scary, right? It's scary to receive a death threat. So that's really about fear, and that's probably about stalking, not necessarily about harassment. So harassment can be part of a stalking case, or sexual stalking might start as harassment, right? Perhaps someone at work is making sexual jokes, texting you at inappropriate times, for example, asking for work in an unreasonable way in the middle of the night or something. But then if they begin following you, trapping you at work, trapping you physically in uncomfortable situations, they book you a room together, okay, that's not just harassment, that's stalking because it would cause fear. So if we're looking at sexual harassment, when you're thinking about charging that or helping a client with that, you might just want to think, is this harassment or is this stalking, or is it both, which it very well could be. But sometimes the word harassment is misused when we're really talking about stalking, and something might start as harassment and then actually become stalking. Another area that I've alluded to but want to focus on is that non-consensual distribution of intimate images, and that's sexually explicit media that's publicly shared online without the consent of the pictured individual. So it's commonly called revenge porn, and we don't like to use that term because it's not really about revenge, because it's not that the victim did something wrong, or it's not necessarily about getting back at someone. And it's not really porn, or at least it wasn't intended to be porn, but commonly it is called revenge porn, and that could be acquired a variety of ways. It could be a photo that was taken at one time consensually and shared. It could be a photo that was not taken consensually as part of an abusive relationship, or it could be something that a secret camera or something that someone took as part of their stalking course of conduct, right? Sneaking a camera in somewhere, taking a picture, and then sharing it or threatening to share it. So the law is starting to catch up on this really common crime. About 43 states and the District of Columbia have laws, and there's a federal law proposed on it. So we hope to see it on the books soon in all 50 states and territories and across the board. Because if you think about it, especially through the use of technology, which is often used to stalk, it's quite easy to do, to acquire these images and share these images. And sometimes the images aren't even real images. So we're going to watch just a short video in a case where Photoshop was used and see the impact that could have in the stalking case. So you play that, Patricia. Thanks.
Erik Baldwin faces some tough federal charges, including stalking. Agents have detailed how he took photos of college athletes and then photoshopped their heads on naked bodies. Then he'd send those fake nude photos to their parents, their teammates, even places where the athletes worked.
They take it very seriously.
The allegations strong enough, this former federal prosecutor says, to catch the attention of the FBI. Now Denver 7 has learned just how far this stalking went. We reviewed actual emails he's accused of sending. In one, Baldwin claimed he was dying from cancer and told a soccer player, "You are a very beautiful woman, and I'd like the chance to spend time with you." Nothing sexual, he said, just a one-time date. Other emails got violent. "I'm looking for a woman or group of women willing to beat me up. I will pay you for your time." In another email, he said he'd been watching a student since her first day on campus. Then he threatened, "You and I are going to spend this weekend alone together. To be clear, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, one way or another, we are going to be alone." Then he described how he would rape the young woman.
Okay, so what we're seeing there, of course, these aren't even real photos. Again, not that that would in any way justify this conduct. But this man is simply remotely photoshopping images and then threatening to share them with the friends and the community. And I'm not sure, it might be on mute. Let me double check. Mute. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. I'm back. So even when these photos aren't real, the impact can be quite similar. We're also increasingly seeing what are called deep fakes, which you may have heard of, and these are basically face swap videos instead of photos. So it's kind of like Photoshop on steroids. And so people have Photoshop or deep faked women into, for example, pornographic films they weren't in. So now you have, an actress's face on a porn actress's body, even though she was never actually in that video. And this can be used for a variety. First of all, it's a sexual crime in its own right because it's creating or sharing sexual images of someone without their consent. And it can lead to more sexual crimes because a lot of perpetrators and stalkers, they use that as leverage then to demand further sexual images, demand actual sex, or to commit actual sexual assault, and essentially extort the victim for their cooperation and silence about the sexual assault that they might perpetrate. So I know in the last few minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about response and what we can do about some of this. And I know this is a lot of information, and it's kind of like, okay, we have an hour to talk about sexual assault and stalking. So I wanted to give you about as much as I could in terms of thinking through how stalking and sexual assault might relate. But I want to again emphasize this is really the tip of the iceberg and the beginning of the learning. And it's extremely under-researched. So most of the research we have is about intimate partner stalkers. And that's important, but it's only half the story. We really need more research to illustrate the connection. But we also know just from our work in the field, from working with law enforcement and victim advocates, even the very definition of stalking is something that causes fear, but these are related crimes, and that many people are experiencing co-victimization but may not be identifying it at the time. So why name stalking? You might be feeling like, okay, I already work on domestic violence. I'm already working on sexual assault. Can you cut me a break? Why do I have to name it stalking? Who cares? It's a bad thing happening to a victim. Does it really matter what we call it? And I would argue, as the person at the stalking organization, that yes, it really is important to name for a few reasons. One, as I've already alluded to, is about charging and prosecution. So most prosecutors, they like to have a menu of charges, right? And sometimes they can do more with a stalking charge than with something else. So it's always great to have that menu. And though the technology often gets blamed for causing stalking, our position is that technology doesn't cause stalking. It's just a tool that stalkers might use or rather misuse to perpetrate stalking. One of the benefits of technology is it often creates a trail where before there wouldn't have been one. It can create evidence. Where before something was an in-person conversation, maybe now it's a text message, and we can actually present that evidence in court. Might be evidence that goes along with another crime, like sexual assault, distribution of non-consensual images, molestation, or a variety of other non-sexual crimes as well, like vandalism, kidnapping. So it could be co-occurring with those crimes, or it could be a separate charge in addition, not in place of it, is what I'm trying to say. But having that option can be really, really helpful in holding that offender accountable. It's also really essential for safety planning for the victim because stalking is its own crime. It's its own course of conduct that requires its own safety plan. When people are experiencing stalking, they're at a higher risk for not only a stalking, it's psychologically damaging, terrible crime in its own right, but they're at a higher risk for physical violence, assault with a weapon, and sexual assault. And homicide. So we want to know when a victim's experiencing stalking so that that should send a red flag off that, wow, this is a high-risk case. We need to safety plan around this victim, around all the behaviors they're experiencing, all the stalking behaviors, and to really pay attention because stalking is an indicator that these other risky behaviors might happen or that these other forms of violence might be inflicted on this victim. But if we don't ask about stalking or name it as stalking, we might miss that. We might miss those risks, right, and not realize how serious a certain case is or how dangerous a certain case might be. And it can also be empowering for victims because instead of just saying, my neighbor's gotten creepy or my ex has gotten weird, to be able to say, I'm experiencing stalking. And that's a crime, and it's not okay, and it's illegal for a reason, and there are resources available, and there are other victims of stalking I can connect with. That can be really powerful to be able to just name that. And so naming stalking is so essential for all of those and more reasons. So when you respond to victims, the first thing you want to do is advise disengagement, and this is because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if they call 25 times and the victim picks up on time 26 and says, I hate you, stop calling me, the next day they're calling 26 times because any contact's a win. So we want to discourage that. That being said, of course, that's not always possible, and we know that, right? So you want to have an open conversation with victims about, say, you know, here's why I'm advising disengagement, and if that's not possible, let's have a conversation about it, because there are victims who say, you know, I call him at 2 a.m. because that's when he gets off work at the bar, and I can hear him drive home and get into bed and fall asleep. Then I know he won't come to my house and wake my kids up. So that's not a victim reaching out because she's not afraid. It's a victim reaching out because she is afraid. But sometimes in a court of law, it can seem like, oh, she called, and how scared can she really be, right? And you don't want to be cut off as law enforcement, victim advocate, et cetera, when that happens. So let the victim know, here's why I'm advising disengagement. That may not always be realistic. Let's talk about it and safety plan around it and be transparent about it. Documentation is also really, really critical because, unfortunately, because stalking by definition is a pattern, one incident, especially if it's not something criminal on its own, is often not enough, right, to prosecute or get a protective order, et cetera. And so, unfortunately, it often falls to victims, and hopefully with the help of victim advocates and law enforcement, to document the stalking they're experiencing. And I'll show you a log for that in just a second. And safety needs and support services, of course, connecting them with safety planning, and our website has some places to start on that. So here's a copy of the stalking incident log, and this is available on our website here on Stalking Incident and Behavior Documentation Log under web links. So feel free to click there to see it. And this is a really concise way to get victims to document what they're experiencing. Often we tell victims to document and that we need to collect evidence, but we don't actually tell them what they need. So, you know, they might bring in hundreds of pages, and it's not necessarily relevant or realistic for a law enforcement officer to go through with them. So this distinctly asks them to capture the date, time, description, location, because stalking almost by definition is taking place across jurisdictions, right? And many victims don't understand that. So they'll just feel like, I reported this to the police and the police didn't help, not realizing, oh, I crossed a county line, and these groups don't always share information the way that, you know, would be ideal if they did. If there's any witnesses, the police called in the officer name. So we often joke, you know, you ask a victim, like, well, who'd you talk to? They'll say, oh, you know, it's a white bald guy in a uniform. So it's not necessarily super helpful. And law enforcement should realize that they're asking for the badge number. It's not necessarily to file a complaint. It's just to keep track, because these stalking cases, the average duration of a stalking case is 2 years, which actually shocked me when I learned. And so really these go on a long time and involve a lot of different incidents, and it's really just a helpful way to have them keep track of all their reports and everything like that. The only thing we excluded from here is how did it make the victim feel. And we did that intentionally because if they do prosecute this, through the chain of evidence, that could actually end up with the offender, with the defendant, and we don't want them to see, you know, oh, I didn't care when the offender showed up, called me, but I really care when the offender showed up at the kid's school, because we don't want them to get out and go right to the kid's school, right? So we don't want to educate them on being better stalkers. That's why we left out how it made them feel. And we also, you know, victims might forget the time or the sequence, but they're not going to forget how they felt when it happened. So that's why we excluded that. But of course, you can adapt it as needed. For orders of protection, you know, there's pros and cons. The pro is that it criminalizes and makes it possible for an officer to arrest a perpetrator for now driving by the home, right, if there has to be a certain distance away. And so law enforcement officers tend to really like the order of protection because it clearly makes something criminal, and now if they violate the protective order, that's almost proof of stalking just right there. But there's some cons as well. So one of the major cons is that it can escalate the behavior. Sorry, I just cut out for a second. It can escalate the behavior. So, and certainly we see that, you know, any change in state. So if a victim blocks their phone number, then the offender might show up in person, right, because they cut off that avenue. If they get a protective order, they might get very angry and say, you think this will help, you can't get away from me. So it's best really to ask the victims how they think the perpetrator will react, because some will say, oh my goodness, the offender will be so mortified they will back right off, and some will say the offender won't care at all, or it'll just make them angry. Also, it's worth asking, is the victim willing to call the police? Because that might sound obvious, but a lot of victims aren't. And so, you know, if they're not willing to do that for whatever reason, the order of protection is not going to be that helpful. It's only as good as the enforcement. And they are often violated, but, you know, that can help for a criminal prosecution. But, of course, like with all safety planning strategies, there's no guarantee of absolute safety, right? So it's helping victims weigh those pros and cons and think through that. I want to leave you with a few resources, and hopefully I'll have time for a couple questions at the end, and if not, I really hope that you do reach out for me. So SPARK is a project of Equitas, the Prosecutor's Resource for Violence Against Women. They offer 24/7 technical assistance for all crimes, including stalking. So they're great, and if you are working with prosecutors, you are a prosecutor working a stalking case, or now that you've been through this webinar, you're thinking, hey, maybe I want to add a stalking charge on there. They're a great resource. Another note on adding a stalking charge and why it's so great is that if someone's prosecuting just an assault, for example, they can't bring in facts from 2 years ago, right, because it's not relevant to this particular case. But if it's a stalking charge, the entire pattern of behavior is relevant, and so now prosecutors can bring in that time that he stood there being really creepy. Like, that is now relevant to the case in a way that if we're just talking about a single incident of assault, it's not relevant. So it can be a really, really powerful tool when prosecutors use it and when judges understand it. In terms of technology safety, and I didn't have time to go in depth on the use of technology to stalk here, but I gave a few examples that included technology. NNDDV's Tech Safety Net team, they have a wonderful resources on technology, safety planning around technology. They have a free app that Victim Advocates I really recommend to you because it can just show you kind of how different pieces of technology are used or misused and how victims can plan for safety around them. So definitely suggest you check that out. For non-consensual image distribution, here's just a few resources. Safe Shepherd's great. Their job is to clean up the online reputation of their clients, and if it's a stalking victim working with an advocate, which they define broadly, it could be a victim advocate or law enforcement, they will do it for free. So that's a great resource as well as these others. Unfortunately, there's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and they will refer to local organizations. Often the Stalking Responses housed under the Domestic Violence Response, so they'll kind of help victims get there. So that's a great, just, you know, if you're giving out on your website the RAIN hotline and the DV hotline, make sure you include Victim Connect as well to help stalking victims. And of course, everybody's favorite website, stalkingawareness.org, and our social media at Follow Us Legally. Again, we share plenty of resources, and we're new. We just launched this website in November. We really want to help you do your work and get you whatever you need to be incorporating stalking into your efforts. We know there's already a lot on your plate. So please, please reach out to us with anything that you need. We're here for you. We want to help you. We want to make your lives easier. Another tool I want to highlight quickly, like I said, stalking is a major risk for physical violence as well as actual lethality. So the majority of femicide cases from intimate partner, the vast majority, like 85%, there was stalking before that case, before that femicide. So there is actually an assessment tool that you can use to analyze the risk in a stalking case that's specific to stalking. It's called SHARP. The SHARP assessment web link is down there, and that will pull out a narrative report and some safety suggestions, which of course doesn't replace the individualized safety planning that a victim advocate would do, but it's a great starting point, and this is for intimate and non-intimate partner stalking. So if you are using LAP or any other sort of risk assessment, this is a great one to make sure your staff know. It's free online, so you can just go and use it, and you can test it out before you use it. So that being said, I have a minute left, so I'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you again so much for the amazing work that you're doing to help victims of sexual assault and domestic violence and to hold offenders accountable. You're out there doing the work every day. We so appreciate you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of this busy month with lots of activities to focus in on stalking a little bit. I really hope it was helpful. We have this link to an evaluation and survey, and we're available to do trainings. We're the technical assistance and training provider for the Office of Violence Against Women. So if you're thinking, wow, this was great, I'd love to learn more about stalking or stalking and technology, or we love you so much, Dana, please come train us. dreams come true, we might be able to do that. So check out our website, request a training, etc. So unfortunately, I'm out of time. I'm so sorry. I'll try to reach out to the folks who ask these great questions. But again, thanks so much for the work you do. Have a wonderful rest of your Sexual Assault Awareness Month with all of your great activities. And I hope this is just the beginning of our conversation on sexual assault and stalking and not the end, and that I planted some seeds here. So please reach out anytime, and thanks so much for your time and for your work. And please fill out an evaluation because it's really helpful. And with that, I will pass it back to Patricia.
Hi, thank you so much, Dana. I actually had it scheduled till 12:30 my time, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to answer a couple more questions, but the room is available for you for the next half an hour.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, then absolutely. Sorry, I had for an hour, but I am happy to answer any questions. So let me scroll up here and see. Let's see. Someone has asked, I work at a rape crisis center. Our state doesn't currently have a law addressing non-consensual pornography. How do you suggest we work with law enforcement to view some of these cases from a stalking lens? They otherwise are not considered criminal. Yeah, that can be quite frustrating, and I'm sorry to hear that. That's a great question. I think that getting law enforcement, taking a look at your stalking statute, which I'm happy to do with you in more depth, and so with the folks at Equitas, and helping law enforcement understand and really buy into that stalking charge. We do a lot of training for law enforcement, so we can also come out and do that. But it's a really powerful charge because it can cover quite a bit depending on your stalking statute. So in terms of working with them, I think a lot of it's an education piece of saying, and there is something that can be done, right? I think a lot of times with these situations, people say, well, there's just nothing to do. There's no law on the books. But the truth is, there are laws on the book. Even if there's not that law on that book in your state, it should be a criminal behavior for a variety of reasons. So I don't have any super great concrete suggestions for you except to say, share some of these resources on non-consensual image distribution, share some of these stalking resources, feel free to reach out for training from us, and just explain that this is a pattern of behavior that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear and that it's not acceptable, and that until your laws catch up, there is actually still something that you can do about it. So sorry, we should give you more helpful, and please feel free to reach out to me or to Equitas after for more questions on that. Let me see, Patricia, do you see any other questions here? I'm just scrolling through.
No, I don't think so. I think that might have been the only other one.
Okay, do folks have any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. I guess I just did such a good job explaining you have no questions. But if some occur to you later, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to talk to you. Like I said before, thanks so much for the work you're doing, and please answer the evaluation. Thanks so much.